This is a 2009 Maserati GranTurismo S, and it's different from every other Maserati GranTurismo in the world because this one has a gated 6-speed manual transmission. Maserati never built this car with a manual, but this one's been converted. And today I'm going to review it and show you the quirks and features of what could have been. Before I get started, big news, this Maserati GranTurismo is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This is a truly special car. It might be the only GranTurismo on the planet that's been converted to a manual transmission. Certainly the only one I've ever seen or heard about, and it can be yours on Cars and Bids. So once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this gated manual GranTurismo, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of the GranTurismo, the manual swapped GranTurismo, the one. So, a little backstory on why this is so special. The Maserati GranTurismo came out for the 2008 model year, and it replaced the Maserati Coupe and Maserati Spider that had existed before. Now, originally, the GranTurismo was only offered with a traditional torque converter automatic transmission, the usual automatic that virtually all automatic transmission cars have. And that's because Maserati had learned a lesson. You see, earlier performance cars from the late 90s, early 2000s had used for their automatic transmissions a sequential manual, which is essentially a manual transmission but without a clutch pedal. And you could shift with paddles typically, or you could put it in auto mode, but it wasn't great for just cruising around. They were lurchy and clunky, and people hated these sequential manual transmissions in normal vehicle operation. And that included in some Maserati models like the Quattroporte, which shares its platform with this car. So Maserati had seen the arrival of these sequential manuals and then the disdain for them by most people. And so for the GranTurismo, they said no sequential manual, we're just going to do a typical torque converter automatic. But then there was a change. In the 2009 model year, the second year on the market for the GranTurismo, Maserati came out with the GranTurismo S. This car is a GranTurismo S, and it came with a few changes relative to the standard GranTurismo. A big one was the powertrain. The regular GranTurismo is a 4.2-liter V8 with about 400 horsepower, but the GranTurismo S, this car, has a 4.7-liter V8 with 435 horsepower. More engine size, more engine power. But the other and the most important change was that Maserati ditched the torque converter automatic for the 09 GranTurismo S and went back to one of those sequential manual transmissions. But they didn't do it for long. In the United States, this 09 GranTurismo S was the only model year for the sequential manual transmission. After 09, they went right back to the torque converter and stuck with it for the entire rest of the GranTurismo production run, which lasted almost a decade. Now, that's a big deal for this car in particular, because while it's fairly easy to swap a sequential manual transmission into a full 3-pedal manual like this car has, it's much more difficult to swap a full torque converter automatic with a manual. That requires a lot of custom parts and fabrication. It basically can't be done in any cost-effective way. And so, if you were going to swap a Maserati GranTurismo to a manual transmission, you had to use a 2009 GranTurismo S, which is the only GranTurismo that offered the sequential manual. And reportedly, there's only about 300 of these cars in the United States this model year with this transmission, meaning it's incredibly rare just to begin, but then you have the manual swap. Now, you might be surprised I'm making such a big deal out of the manual swap because this has been a pretty common common thing for a lot of cars. Ferraris over the last few years, many of them have been manual swapped, but not just that. Lamborghinis, Aston Martins, a lot of manual swaps out there, but this car is particularly unusual because, number one, you had to do it with one of those rare '09 GranTurismo S, and number two, the value of the GranTurismo has stayed relatively low compared to Ferrari and Lamborghini models, and so it's hard to justify going through the trouble to manual swap a GranTurismo, and that's why I suspect this is the only one that's had it done. It's especially interesting because this car was only ever offered with an automatic transmission, so it's not like you install the manual with the shifter and the gate and it just comes from another GranTurismo. Instead, these parts had to be derived from Ferrari models, which generally share a transmission, and so this is a totally new look in this interior. Having a gated manual, it was something this car was never designed for and never happened from the factory, which makes it especially cool. But anyway, we'll get more to the transmission in the driving review of this car. Next, let's move on to the powertrain. So like I said, base car had a 4.2 V8. This one has a 4.7 V8 that was derived, co-developed with Ferrari. And that gave this car some real credibility in the performance car realm, a Ferrari engine in the Maserati. And it looks cool. You can see the Maserati Trident right there in the center. The powertrain, actually, this is how Ferrari engines from this era also look because they are very similar powertrains shared between these two cars. Also interesting, you can see the engine is set pretty far back in the engine bay, almost behind the front wheels, the majority of the weight, which obviously is done for weight distribution. Getting that weight into the center of the car makes it more agile as opposed to sticking a lot of pounds out over the front axle, which makes it feel front heavy when you're driving. Now, 435 horses may not seem like that much, but this was intended to be kind of part luxury car, part performance car, and it was pretty quick. 0 to 60 was in the mid to high 4-second range with the automatic transmission these cars had, and so it was relatively fast. But most importantly, probably the best part about this engine is the way it sounds. Take a listen to the glorious roar of the GranTurismo with the 4.7. But anyway, next we move on to the outside of this car, the exterior design, which is very distinctive and to a lot of people very elegant and beautiful. I personally have never loved how the GranTurismo looks. I think it's a little too long and stretched, particularly in the front, but the majority of human beings completely disagree with me, and this car is generally considered to be a very beautiful, very attractive car whose design really stayed fresh and clean and nice for a long time. So long, in fact, that Maserati used this design from '08 for more than a decade, the original GranTurismo run, and then when they finally redesigned this car a couple of years ago, they changed all the electronics, everything except the overall look of the car, which stayed basically the same even for the brand new model. Now, the design's starting to get a little tired, and so this has not been a particularly popular redesign with no major changes, but it does illustrate how Maserati was thinking. We made something beautiful, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it, even if it's been almost 20 years with the same general look. Now, on the outside, one thing that Maserati has done for the last couple decades is really emphasize that the vehicles are Maserati. You can see up front there is a typical badge where you'd expect an emblem, but then there is another large badge in the front grille. In back, rather than just the Maserati Trident logo, the word Maserati is written out in large print, making it very clear to whoever's behind you exactly what you're driving. You also have the Maserati Trident logo on the side pillars, the rear quarter, as you can see, on one side, and then over on the other. And of course, Maserati's center caps in the wheels, but then also the wheel design itself is intended to look like the Maserati Trident logo. Most of the wheel designs for this car followed that path, which gave you like an extra sort of hidden subliminal Maserati logo all throughout the wheels. In addition to that, in the front quarter, you have the Pininfarina badge, the designer of this car, and then right above you have the fender vents, which when this car came out, that was a huge trend in the car industry, putting fender vents on to make the cars look cool. Kind of pioneered with like the BMW Z8 in the early 2000s, but it got really popular exactly in this era. Of course, the E92 M3 had it, the Maserati Quattroporte, and many other cars, and this was one of them, showing up for the trends of its day to maximize its in-the-moment coolness. One other interesting quirk on the outside is that the door handle to this car doesn't just pull open. Instead, there are two little door poppers on the inside of the door handle. On the driver's side, on the right, the door popper is mechanical. So you push that and it opens with a mechanical latch. On the left, the door popper is electronic. So if you push that, it opens with like an electronic pop, a little less effort. You could walk up to the car and pick if you wanted to open the door electronically or mechanically. Now, your hand would fall more likely to the electronic popper, which is what they were hoping for, and you just open up the door, but the mechanical popper was integrated in there as well, so that if the electronic failed, you had a backup right there with easy access. And then you have the interior. Now, the overall design of this interior is reasonably nice. It works for the time period, and it kind of fits the ethos and personality of this car. No crazy design details, but it all kind of fits together well, and the materials used are relatively nice and kind of in keeping with a car at this price point, although, like in all Ferrari and Maserati models as they age, the plastic buttons and kind of trim started to get a little sticky in this car, and every time you tap it, you get a little sticky on your fingers. Fortunately, this can be easily remedied, but I am astonished that after decades with this problem, it is still a problem in Ferrari and Maserati models, and I have no idea why they don't just fix it. Now, as you can see right here in the center, of course, the manual transmission lever, like I showed you before, gated 6-speed manual, with reverse down and to the left. It all actually looks pretty stock and pretty nice, considering that these cars were never initially made with a manual transmission. It really looks from this, you'd never be able to tell. It looks like it's kind of a factory swap or a factory part. The only kind of unusual thing is because these were never offered with real manuals, you have an electronic parking brake. And so you don't have that normal feeling where you park the car and then pull up on the brake. Instead, you engage an electronic brake, which just doesn't seem right with 3 pedals, but that is the situation with this car. And honestly, it works just fine. Now, as you might imagine, this interior has quite a few rather interesting quirks. And we'll begin with the infotainment system. The center screen is not a touchscreen, and so instead it has a vast array of buttons down below, including an entire phone dial number pad, several dials that can be twisted, all to control this central infotainment screen. Amazingly, despite all of these buttons, there is no menu screen to pull up the radio in general. There is not like a radio screen in this infotainment system. Instead, the only way you can access the radio is if you press the band button, and then it pulls up like what band you're listening to, AM or FM, and from there you can adjust left or right to change the station you're on or tap one of your presets. There isn't just a radio menu you can stay on like a screen while you're driving. It doesn't exist, which is totally bizarre design. Now, with that said, Maserati did try to rectify that situation by giving you a gauge cluster screen in the center that can show exactly what radio or music you're listening to at any given time, and there are quite a few controls on the steering wheel that adjust the stereo or the infotainment in general. Over on the left, you have volume. Over on the right, you have track. And then there are buttons behind the steering wheel, actually switches up, down, and buttons in the center that can adjust various different other preferences for the infotainment system or for the radio. And so you actually have pretty good display and control from the driver's perspective. It's just weird that there's no overall radio screen in the center. Now, to the left of the infotainment system, you have a few kind of traditional buttons here. There's an auto button, which if you had the sequential manual transmission in, you press that, you go in auto mode. You also have a sport mode here. MSP off is for stability control. The weird one is park off. You look at that and it seems like the button for your parking sensors. It is not. You press park off before you turn off the car, and that will disable the automatic parking brake from turning on. I'm not sure why anyone would really want that feature, but it's a button that's pretty available to be pushed. Now, the parking sensors are also on a button. They are to the left side of the steering wheel. You can see the parking sensor on-off button here, completely different from the button that is labeled Park Off, which has nothing to do with the parking sensors. Sort of unusual. And next up, here's another weird quirk. On the seats, you can see on the side of the seat, there are buttons marked 1, 2, 3. Those are for seat memory, but the buttons cannot be viewed from the seat. The markings are positioned out, sort of facing towards the door to the side of the car, and you can't actually see which memory setting you are pressing when you're sitting in the seat trying to press a seat memory setting, which is very odd. Now, one surprise in this car is that despite being a 2009 model, you open up the glove box and you can see a USB port in there. That was not for devices to plug into the infotainment system. It was just for charging, but that's a pretty impressive feature for a car, again, from 2009. USB was really just kind of starting to take off, and it's nice to have that feature in there, even just for device charging, is pretty cool to see. Also a nice little quirk, you look in the door pocket storage area, and you can see there's a little panel that's placed right in the middle that separates the front door pocket storage compartment from the rear. And so if you have something that you want to keep away from something else, well, you have that choice, a front and rear separated door pocket storage area for your two potentially dueling items. No, I'm just kidding. The reason they do that is because the rear is intended to be used by rear passengers. And indeed, this car has back seats, and surprisingly nice ones. You fold forward the front seats and you can see you have direct access to the back seats, which look pretty good. 2 individual buckets here and some surprising amenities. You have 2 cup holders in back, which is obviously nice for comfort and convenience. And then in addition, you have climate vents back here, which is kind of a surprise for rear seats that are typically not going to be used that frequently. But this is the GranTurismo, a true grand touring car, and so if you were on a grand tour, you might want to bring your children along in the back, and so you want to keep them comfortable. There's even an armrest back there, which of course adds to rear seat comfort. And the rear seats are pretty nice. They have all the same luxury details you have up front, like the colored contrast stitching. You can see black stitching on the red seats, which looks good, and the lines in the leather, which sort of adds some definition and tone and class. You have that in back just like in front, and even the Maserati logo embossed into the headrest just like in front. You have that in back. The rear seat's a surprisingly decent place to spend time despite this car's sort of exotic 2-door persona. And then there's the trunk, the cargo area in the GranTurismo, which you can see is not particularly large, good enough for some luggage for a grand tour, but not exactly huge. You're not using this thing to move flat screen TVs. Although with that said, it is nice that this panel on the bottom has a little latch. You can lift it up and there's an extra storage compartment under the floor where you have more space to store more stuff, which is something you very rarely see in exotic cars like this one, sort of that extra underfloor storage. It's a good nod to extra practicality for this car and good attention to detail. The last interesting thing though in this trunk is the little tab that you can pull in case you get stuck inside the trunk, the emergency trunk release. And on it, you can see there is a perfectly faithful diagram drawing of someone jumping out of the trunk of a Maserati GranTurismo. This isn't just a generic car like in so many other trunk release latches. Instead, it's literally a GranTurismo, and it's shocking they put that level of detail on this. In fact, this part was used by a lot of other Maserati and I think maybe even some Ferrari models. This exact drawing showing someone exiting a GranTurismo trunk. This very surprisingly accurate depiction of that exact happening. But you probably aren't interested only in this car's quirks, but also the way it drives. I know I am, maybe because that's the quirkiest quirk of all, since this is very likely the only manual GranTurismo. So with that in mind, let's get it out on the road and see how this car would have driven if it had 3 pedals from the factory. All right, driving the manual GranTurismo. I am so excited about this car. When this car got submitted to us at Cars and Bids, I said to our team, we've got to get it here. We shipped it all the way from the East Coast just so I could do this video. And it's an interesting one for two reasons. Number one, I've never been a huge fan of this version of the GranTurismo. The general public opinion is that it looks great. I've never loved the styling, and I never loved the fact that they were automatic only. But I have always loved the chassis and the motor sound and like the way it drives. I think that the steering and handling is better than this car has any right to be, considering that it's a Maserati and not like, you know, a Ferrari or a Lamborghini, like a real purpose-built focused sports car. The chassis has always been wonderful. And I think the steering is just like really predictable, linear, flat, like about as good a steering as you're gonna ever really see in a four-seater kind of long GT car. And so I've always really liked that aspect of it. And now here we have the chance to drive it with a manual, and basically the only one on the planet with a manual probably, which really adds to the interesting appeal of this car. So first impression is the manual is exactly what I was hoping that it would be. Like, it's good for one thing. I mean, all of these manual swaps generally use what would be more or less OEM parts. This one obviously a Ferrari gate or something close to it, but if they had done a manual GranTurismo, this would have been that. And it feels nice. The clutch is stiffer than I would expect it to be, considering it's probably mostly Ferrari stuff. The Ferrari clutch has never felt quite this stiff to me, but it's fine. It's like totally doable. It's not so heavy or awful that it's like unusable by any means. And the gate is cool. I mean, driving around in a gated manual is always a cool thing, and pairing that to this car is especially cool. And then of course you have the other great GranTurismo benefits, like the sound and the way that it drives. I mean, again, like I said, the chassis in this car I've always felt is just so good. And boy, that's just clear anytime you take it around any corner. It's just flatter than it ought to be, and more comfortable than it ought to be, and the steering is tighter than it ought to be, and it was a great car from a driving perspective. Oh, rowing the gears, combining that with rowing the gears is just so cool. Feel very confident in the transmission too. Do not feel like there is any sort of, you know, fragility to it. I'm driving it just like I would drive a normal manual transmission, non-converted, non-one-off car, and it drives totally fine without any problem or issue, exactly how I'd expect. You can jam it in a gear. It really feels like it's a factory effort. And it really drives wonderfully. And I really think that the manual transmission wakes up this car in a way that I was kind of hoping that it would. Like I said, I really think this is a great car from a driving perspective, but I really think it was let down by the fact that it didn't have a manual. At least I think that would have made it more fun. Probably the customers they were going for, it didn't really matter that much. But at least, especially on the secondhand market where these cars are, you know, finding their way into people's hands for a lot less money, I think a lot of people would love to kind of toss one around with a stick, especially considering how good the driving experience turned out to be in this car, that you never really expected to have a really hugely good driving experience. But it does. It's wonderful, and the manual wakes it up. Truthfully, I actually am more impressed by this car than I expected I would be. It really does provide an excellent complement to the driving experience that's already pretty good in the Maserati GranTurismo. And it's a good manual. First is a little bit hard to find sometimes, which I notice also in like my Countach. You have to kind of go to second to line up the gears and then get it into first, which sometimes is typical in exotic manual transmission exotic cars. Other than that issue, it drives beautifully. It's exactly what you'd expect. And it really does help you get kind of more out of this GranTurismo chassis and this GranTurismo driving experience. Like I've said, never been the biggest fan of this car. Always thought it was sort of an also-ran exotic car. It's definitely woken up and made more exciting and more fun and more enjoyable with the addition of 3 pedals, for sure. Obviously, it's more controllable, but just the chassis is so good. It's flat, it's sharp, and adding a manual, really, it gives you kind of a 612 or a 599 vibe. It makes it feel faster. It's a really pretty impressive overall experience and a real upgrade over a standard GranTurismo, at least in my opinion. I'm quite happy with this car. And so that's the manual swap 2009 Maserati GranTurismo S. What an interesting car. This adds a whole new fun dimension to the GranTurismo, to an already great chassis. It's a serious improvement and very special, and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give this GranTurismo a DougScore.
And the DougScore is here, 57 out of 100, which puts this GranTurismo here against rivals. This car is actually pretty damn cool, as it's a fantastic chassis that benefits from even more engagement with the swapped manual transmission. This GranTurismo could use a little love, but with a few detail upgrades like addressing the sticky buttons, you'd have the coolest modern Maserati this side of the MC12. Finally, an engaging manual transmission to go with this otherwise surprisingly rewarding chassis and engine combination.